Welcome back and to this next lesson, the justification for existence. So what really inspired this particular lesson is a question that's on a lot of people's minds. Certainly something that the existentialist philosophers dealt with extensively. That is, what are we even doing here? Why is it that we suffer? Do we really cause our own suffering, as many Buddhists would like us to believe? And if not, then why do we suffer? How is that fair? And if we do, then why on earth did we choose to suffer? I mean, surely the statement itself is inherently contradictory, isn't it? Because if I cause my own suffering through my own choices, then why don't I just stop doing that? Well, indeed, that is actually what shadow work is about. It's ceasing to do harm to the self. And shadow work comprises a large part of individuation more broadly. But presumably, if I'm suffering nonetheless, then even if I was causing it, I wouldn't know how I was causing it. And so is my ignorance around such matters my own fault? Well, if so, it implies that I chose it, which would imply that I was wise enough to choose otherwise, but I didn't. So that can't make any sense. So the statement is inherently contradictory, because if we caused everything that happened to us, then we would just simply choose to stop suffering, wouldn't we? But the fact that we suffer unwisely suggests that we didn't have the wisdom in the first place with which to do otherwise. So why on earth then do we suffer, and what to do about it? Well, Jean-Paul Sartre said that freedom is what you do with what's been done to you. I think this quote goes a long way to explaining the reality or the necessity of suffering and the opportunity of freedom. Because here's why. Firstly, suffering must be possible and evil must be possible, because we're free to do evil. Everyone is. No matter whatever happens to you, those around you have free will and they're free to do whatever they choose. Sure, I mean, the reason they might choose to do harmful things is because they don't know any better. Or perhaps it's because some part of them aspires to wholeness and has mistaken their evil acts as a sort of surrogate for wholeness. Now, beyond the point, they might do that as a way to avoid their journey, and they might do so willingly. But also, they might be doing so because some part of them is calling out for their attention and saying, hey, look, here's a problem, solve this. Desperate to understand what the consequences are of robbing a shop so that I can face that part of me that just cannot bear to be seen that way, for example. So they're not clear on what's going on, they're not practicing responsibility, and there's clearly some free choice in that. There has to be, because that's what freedom allows us to do. But here's an offering as to why all of this can be allowed to happen, why you can suffer, why I can suffer. And it's because these are actually opportunities to exercise freedom, to grow in freedom, and to become more self-conscious. So freedom is actually an opportunity. Freedom is not only a higher value than, say, freedom from suffering or freedom from evil. Freedom exists because, in a sense, it's better to have freedom than it is to be free of suffering and not have freedom. Suffering and evil is the price we pay for freedom. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that, as I said earlier, the only thing that's inherently non-contradictory. Freedom is, in essence, non-contradictoriness. And so our journey in becoming self-conscious is actually to become ever more uncontradictory in ourselves, undivided in ourselves. This is what individuation means. And that's why it's akin to finding freedom. It is becoming ever less contradictory internally. And with that, violating the freedom of others less and less, because that would be a contradiction. If we were to do to others what we did not want done to ourselves, then that would be contradictory. And not only in a specific sense, in the sense of our idiosyncratic preferences, like forcing our preference for chocolate cake on other people. No, it's about honoring our own willingness to be ourselves, our own interest in being ourselves, honoring others' interest and need to be themselves, whatever that means for them. That would be non-contradictory. So we've all been harmed by others. We've all had difficult childhoods to one degree or another. And freedom is what we do with that. We are free to do with that whatever we will. We can choose to not do that if we like. We can choose to employ all kinds of mental gymnastics and rationalizations and avoidance and coping mechanisms as a way to placate that tension, to achieve dissonance but not achieve any reconciliation. We're free to do that. That'd be the avoidance of synthesis. But you see, that's what freedom allows us to do. So this freedom then is naturally rather terrifying because, as Erich Fromm said, acquiring self-knowledge is the most difficult process because it encounters the energy of resistance by which the unconscious is defended against the attempt to make it conscious. So freedom is terrifying because it means going against that energy, the energy by which the unconscious is defended against the energy of resistance. This is a question of energy. And so there is no getting around that. There must be a felt tension. And it is the very experience of tension that is the reconciliation. So no wonder so many people are avoidant of inner work or terrified of freedom. You're free to not be free. There is an endless market of ways to avoid freedom. And it's debatable whether that's supply-driven or demand-driven. In other words, is it actually that, to a large extent, many folks actually don't want freedom, and therefore that creates the market for avoidance of freedom, all manner of bread and circuses, perhaps. But you see, the only reason they avoid freedom is because they're free to avoid freedom. You are free to avoid freedom. You're still free. You're just freely choosing to avoid freedom. You're choosing to not resolve that energetic tension. However, comes a time where there really is no other choice. It has to be worked through, where that becomes priority number one. And I think culturally in the West, we're moving towards that stage. This is why there's a lot more talk of selfhood in the last couple of years, certainly since COVID. There's a lot more libertarianism politically, slowly bubbling under. And my thesis is that the very idea of selfhood and the need to face oneself and to understand the unconscious mind and to do things like active imagination and to take responsibility for your mind, not just your world, but your mind, and understand the workings of mind. These are growing themes for good reason, because these are what we need to do. It's what you need to do. It's what I need to do in order to truly solve our challenges. This is the current challenge, right? So freedom can be terrifying, but freedom is also the greatest gift and opportunity. Sometimes it can feel like life is just one rite of passage after the other. Like it's just one constant challenge. And yet every now and then you stop and look back and go, but hang on, I wouldn't change it for the world. And as much as we struggle every day, if we're doing things right, we're probably struggling quite often. It doesn't always have to be like that. And also that every struggle is a compensation for something that's felt somewhere. Every struggle, every moment spent struggling brings with it a commensurate reward and opportunity. So there's no dead weight loss here. There's no waste of time or waste of energy. Suffering isn't something that the universe imposes upon us because it's sadistic. And the sooner we get over that idea, the better. That's truly a childish view of the universe. See it as an opportunity. It contains the seeds of not only your own coming to consciousness, but your ability to realize yourself in a spiritual sense. And that's just something that cannot be measured or demarcated in a material sense. So very hard to put a value on that. It is where our minds want to go ultimately. So even through our challenges, there is the opportunity to pursue freedom. That's the greatest gift of all, right? What an opportunity. Speaking of suffering, I did refer to this image in a previous course. This is inspired by the Buddhist idea of dukkha, which is sometimes translated somewhat erroneously as suffering. Many people have thought about it in different ways. But really, I think this kind of just is pointing to this misalignment that we experience in life. The word dukkha derives, we think, from two words, du and ka, which means something like bad chariot or bad axle within a chariot wheel or something like this, like a bumpy ride. So I've tried to illustrate a slightly wonky wheel on this chariot here to illustrate that something's like a little bit out of alignment. And I think this is completely in line with what Hegel was saying and the rest of the idealist philosophers. Even though Buddhism didn't explicitly discuss this idea of the unconscious mind, it certainly understood that our own will or our own desire, which are not the same thing, but nonetheless, our own will or our own desire have some role to play in our struggle, in our suffering. But where Hegel and certainly some interpretations of Buddhism seem to misalign is the idea that because the will or desire always shows up whenever there's misalignment, therefore the cure for that is just to eliminate the will, just to put the fire out. Hegel would have disagreed with that, because clearly there's this great unfolding. The whole reason we have a universe is because it's iterative. It relates to itself. It's constantly evolving into higher orders of sophistication, just as we are doing within ourselves as well. So the way through it is through it, not to retreat. The way through it is to synthesize. That's how you move towards truth, is to say, okay, I've got a thesis. There's something in the world that's come to challenge it. What is the truth that is common to both? How do I transcend this challenge? How do I negate the negation? That is through responsibility. So I don't think you can really say there's anything bad or wrong with Buddhism exactly. It was one of many theses available at the time, and it has some value because everything has value. However, a lot of its contradictions can actually be addressed through this concept of the unconscious mind. How can one, for example, differentiate between personal egocentric desires and the will of spirit without an understanding of the unconscious mind and the differentiation between the two? There's the risk of just assuming that all desire is just unwholesome. All desire is just, we don't know why it's problematic. We don't know how it's come about. We don't know how in our apparent wisdom we put ourselves in this position, but somehow we've got ourselves just doing this thing that exists. We call it desire, and yet it serves no purpose other than to make us suffer. Maybe actually it serves a good purpose, just about understanding the difference between wholesome desire and unwholesome desire. When otherwise you have to explain, it just raises 100 million more questions about why this desire in the first place, how we got into this position. And a Buddhist might say, well, those things aren't useful to the elimination of desire, so we don't want to think about them. Well, that's really just taking the conclusion that desire is bad as an assumption, a given, rather than delving into a further inquiry there. Personally, I don't think there's anything in this universe that exists in isolation, let alone without a purpose, let alone therefore as a way of understanding more about ourselves and existence. There's insight everywhere. So suffering plays a role in all of this because it is the felt experience of tension. It is how we know that something's misaligned. So see, I think a better take on this is this word misalignment. We experience it in the form of energetic tension in our minds. This is how we know that something isn't making sense. Something isn't aligning with itself. Something doesn't check out. Contradiction exists because we experience it, but it's through contradiction that things come back to wholeness, come back to the absolute, the place of complete non-contradiction. So it's through bearing tension that it becomes resolved. So we do well not to avoid tension, but to take responsibility for tension, to take responsibility for our suffering, for where we feel pain. It's not that, oh, I caused it, therefore I better stop doing that. It's more that you can do something about it, even if you didn't necessarily cause it. That's the difference. So that's how we grow and expand in freedom and awareness. In much the same way, I said, here you've got gravity. Gravity exists in relation to something else. If you didn't have a planet Earth, there'd be no gravity. If you didn't have gravity, that would imply you don't really have Earth. If you don't have suffering, you don't have any meaning, you don't have an experience, you don't have existence. So I've talked about this at length in the first course, but here's just a recap and to drill down on this point about why it is we suffer and what this actually means in terms of an opportunity. It's not just something that exists in isolation because the universe is a bad thing that just exists for some reason. No, there's an opportunity here to actually really understand ourselves and attain greater freedom through responsibility. So individuation begins, as I've alluded to, the day that you recognize the danger of not taking responsibility exceeds the fear of taking it. So in some sense, simply growing up from being a child to an adult is a process of becoming more and more responsible. It's not a single time event. It's something that happens in many different facets of our lives, one by one, more or less, like one after the other, all the time, attaining greater freedom and control, greater awareness of ourselves and the world around us. But there comes a point where we have to understand the very principle of responsibility itself. And I think this is what it means to begin individuation. It's when one says, okay, I've come as far as I can by postulating an idea of myself in the world. And that has helped me to solve a bunch of problems. There's a series of traits and qualities and desires that I associate with that. That's gotten me so far. But it's also starting to create a series of problems, like the marginal increase of the problems that's being created by that is just increasing. At some point, they start to exceed the benefits. And this, I think, is when it prompts one to go, okay, there's something here that I need to understand about responsibility as a principle, that I can take responsibility for everything that happens to me, including the way I feel, that my very mind, and not least that the very way my mind relates to experience is a large part of the issue. So it's not only what's happening externally. If anything, that's a reflection of what's happening within the minds of every human being. Now, you as one individual human being can't affect all of that. But of course, the way your mind renders that experience just has an inordinately high bearing on how that's actually experienced by you. And that is something that you can inquire into. That is the difference. That is the beginning of individuation. It's the moment you go, okay, I'm not just experiencing a world directly. This is not more or less the way it is. Or at least going beyond thinking that maybe everyone else has an unconscious mind, but I don't. It's recognizing the role of your own unconscious mind and how that's influencing your lived experience. Maybe even the very things that appear in your life. It's a very, very deep mystery, and the sooner one starts investigating it, the better. But I think don't expect ever to finish investigating that mystery. From another perspective, individuation begins when the ego realizes it is not the center of the psyche. I mean, it's the center of conscious attention, right? But it's not truly the forerunner of itself. It is not what there is. If anything, the ego belongs to the broader psyche, not the other way around. The psyche here refers to the totality of mind, including conscious and unconscious. So individuation begins, and in a sense ends as well, when the ego establishes its rightful place. Now, of course, it never truly ends. However, there may well come a point where, to all intents, the ego recognizes that it exists in relation to this wider field, the personal unconscious, including the shadow, including elements of the anima and the animus, and how that all relates to the wider objective psyche, including the whole phylogenetic history of humankind. So it flips it around. It will always be your central point of attention as long as you live, but recognizing that it exists in relationship to, and in some sense to serve, the wider psyche. So responsibility is not something that you have by default, although you do have a kind of freedom, a freedom certainly to respond to what happens to you, and also the freedom to avoid responsibility. That's a use of freedom. However, you can take responsibility. So if you end up in like this chap who yesterday screeched to a halt outside my window and nearly crashed into the back of another car, maybe they both had some kind of role in that. But the very choice to actually drive a car in this city is a choice. It doesn't mean that you cause everything that happens, but your choice to drive the car is one of the many conditions that might come together in some kind of accident. So you can take responsibility for that. You can't control it. You can't control everything, but you can operate within your circles of control and influence to produce your own outcomes. It doesn't mean that you cause everything that you experience, but there is nonetheless a choice to take responsibility. Not taking responsibility is still a kind of choice. So responsibility is something you take voluntarily because you recognize the benefits of doing so. And because not only that, this is not some self-serving choice or end here. It's about aligning yourself with what there is, with spirit itself. Because this is what spirit is doing, right? It's becoming aware of itself in order to take responsibility for its creation. That's another way of looking at it. Okay. That brings us to the end of this episode. So thank you for your time and attention. If you enjoyed it, then please leave me a like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. If you're listening to this on the podcast, I always appreciate ratings and reviews as well. For the Know Yourself program, simply head over to knowyourself.makeitconscious.com, and I'll see you soon.